pleasure to welcome Dr. Jan Szkudliński. I'm going to introduce Dr. Szkudliński in a second to you all. This webinar is being recorded. We're going to make the recording available afterwards. So before we go into the topic for today, I just want to briefly introduce our institution, the Allies Museum, for anybody who might not know us yet. We are a new upcoming museum in central Rome dedicated to the Italian campaign. As part of our mission is to honor the 2 million men from 25 countries that came to Italy and liberated the country from Nazi fascism in World War II. Really the first defenders of freedom and democracy who set foot in Europe. And obviously as part of the very broad coalition that came into Italy, it was the Second Polish Corps led by General Anders. They had quite a route to come to get to Italy, and we're going to hear from Jan in a few seconds. So before that, let me introduce a little bit more about our mission. Really is to honor the sacrifice that were made, and with sort of three prongs: commemorating the people who served. Unfortunately, less than 0.5% of the veterans are still alive today due to the fact that we're over 80 years from the events. Educate those who are serving and inspire those who will serve, and really trying to talk to young people about what young people, the average age of people who fought in campaign was 20 years old, did 80 years ago, so that we can enjoy the free Italy we all know today. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jan Szkudliński. Jan is the curator and head of research at the department at the Museum of Second World War in Gdańsk, which is obviously in Poland. From 2008 to 2017, he was the curator of several thematic sections of the main exhibition at the Museum of Second World War. And then afterward, from 2017 to 2019, he has been the head of the history department at the, and pardon my pronunciation, Gdynia City Museum. Since 2020, he has been involved in developing a new permanent exhibition for the Museum of the Polish Post Office branch of the Museum of Gdańsk. For more than 10 years, he has worked with the Liberation Route Europe Foundation in the project Liberation Route Europe. He has collaborated on more than a dozen temporary and outdoor exhibitions, and is the author of various works, including the book on Chancellorsville, 1863, published in 2006, a dozen or so academic articles on subjects including the controversy over Westerplatte defense, and the new album, Everyday Life of Soldiers of the Polish Armed Forces in the West from 1939 to 1947. Published by the Museum of Second World War in 2016. His research interests include the history of conflicts and military of the 19th and 20th century. He has collaborated on many exhibitions, including Westerplatte, a spa, a bastion, a symbol at the Museum of Second World War in 2009, Luther in Gdynia, in the Gdynia City Museum in 2017, and Sukarski images at the Museum of Gdańsk in 2021. And is the author of an educational path at Westerplatte Museum of Second World War in 2011. He is the Polish translator of dozens of historical books and scientific articles. And well, welcome, Jan. Really a pleasure to have you here. And, as we talk about, obviously, the Polish contribution to Italy, it is remarkable, the path that they took here. And as you guys can see, was sort of depicting their time in Italy from the arrival in Taranto, I believe it was late December 1943, all the way to the liberation of my hometown of Bologna in the spring of 1945. And so I want to kick off asking you, Jan, what role did the Polish Second Corps play in the Italian campaign, and why was their contribution so strategically and symbolically important in this campaign?
Well, first of all, we have to bear in mind that Italian campaign, and by that I mean the landing on Italian peninsula itself, not on Sicily, was an operation which the Western Allies were reluctant to do. Especially, I mean, the Americans, who always believed that France should be the target of the main invasion. Britain, in the person of Winston Churchill, who was reared in the imperial times where Mediterranean was it was called imperial lifeline, was always interested in operating through Mediterranean. It was evident even in the First World War in his schemes to invade the Dardanelles and the operations conducted in Greece. However, the grandest, most numerous ally of Western allies, Soviet Union, which was bearing the brunt of the land war against the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, was always pressing on the Allies to establish a second front in the West. We know, of course, that first the Allies had to evict the Axis forces, I mean the Italians and the Germans, from North Africa. And then to ensure the free passage of shipping through Mediterranean, they decided to capture Sicily as of course, sheltering their fortress at Malta. But then, of course, it seemed that Italy would not be invaded at all. The plans were always debatable, and well, fascism in Italy came to an end quite abruptly. So those events led the Allies to land in Italian peninsula. The first, of course, invasions in south part of near Taranto and especially in Salerno met with fierce German resistance because Nazi Germany, rightly fearing that Italy will turn part, quickly occupied the entire country. And we know, of course, that there was a widespread indecisiveness in the ranks of Italian troops in Italy itself and in the Balkans. That's why the Germans have managed quite easily to occupy entire Italy and disarm most of Italian army. Italian fleet, which had left the bases in the mainland and went for Malta, was attacked by German Air Force with the terrible loss of the newest battleship Roma, with a huge loss of life. So we know that in this situation, the Allies landed in Italy and then were gathering troops to continue the action. It was always the case that Italian campaign was led by multinational forces. On the part of the landing force, there was, of course, a substantial American contingent, British armies, which were augmented by troops from New Zealand, from South Africa, large contingent of Indian army. There were Canadian troops as well. And among them was the Second Polish Corps, which might be a little bit odd because, well, you would believe that Polish troops, if they were ever present in the Western theater, should be operating from Britain. However, Polish army was for a few years now divided into two geographically separated contingents. One of them was the main forces of Polish Navy, Air Force, and Polish land forces, which were organizing in British Isles, but the others were the troops in the Middle East. Their origins were twofold. The smaller part was part of troops which were composed of Polish soldiers who had gathered in then French Syria and in 1939 after the defeat of Poland and took part in the North African campaign, especially during the first siege of Tobruk and the Battle of El Ghazala. The second largest part of these troops were those who came to the Middle East from Soviet Union. In order to understand why those troops were there and what route did they take to end up in Italy, one has to understand that I named Soviet Union as the ally against Nazi Germany, which wasn't always the case. On 23rd of August 1939, just before the beginning of the Second World War, there was in Moscow a treaty between Nazi Germany and Soviet Union was signed, which is now has been living infamously as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact or Hitler-Stalin Pact. The two totalitarian states in Europe, which before had been the most vicious ideological enemies, suddenly came into collusion in order to divide Central and Eastern Europe between themselves. Almost everybody know that it's general knowledge that Nazi Germany invaded Poland, occupied most of it, and conducted a ruthless regime of occupation. It is not as well remembered that Soviet Union did the same in the eastern part of Poland and also later gobbled up the so-called Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Soviet Union also invaded Finland, and after a very bloody conflict took about 10% of Finnish territory, and they also invaded Bessarabia, taking it from Romania. In the occupied lands, Soviet Union conducted operations which were aimed as, there is a process not very known in English, which is supposed to Sovietize those lands. The method of operation was to take over certain areas, then organize mock elections in those areas, in which, of course, the people supposedly in the overwhelming majority have chosen to ask Soviet Union to accept them into the fold of the Soviet nations. I hope it does resemble what Russia is now doing in Ukraine, because it is one and one the same process, well remembered in Central and Eastern Europe. In the occupied lands, Soviet Union would try to eliminate the members of previous elites by arrests, by direct elimination, or by deporting large groups of people into the far depth of Soviet Union. Usually they were either deported to the infamous Gulag labor camps, or they were resettled into the Central Asian Republic of Soviet Union. And the same process happened in Poland, in Eastern Poland. About 400,000 of Poles were deported this way. About 20,000 Polish army officers were executed in the infamous Katyn massacre, and the rest were dispersed amongst the peoples and lands of the massive Soviet Union, with a huge amount of death toll. When in June 1941 Nazi Germany invaded Soviet Union, breaking this collusion or alliance they had with themselves, suddenly it became clear that Western allies are very interested in striking an alliance with Soviet Union, hoping, of course, that Nazi Germany would, the strength of Nazi Germany, which had proved almost unstoppable before, would be dissipated among the huge landmass of Soviet Union. And as a part of this alliance, of course, the new alliance, Soviet Union signed a treaty with the Polish government in exile residing in London. And by that treaty, from those deportees, from those surviving prisoners, a Polish army was supposed to be formed. This army was given to command by General Władysław Anders, who luckily escaped the massacre of Polish officers. And this army was raised in Kazakhstan in Central Soviet Union. The problem was that Stalin wanted those troops to be sent to the front almost immediately, even though they were ridiculously under-equipped by any Western standards or any Polish standards. Stalin wanted to hurl as many soldiers against the Germans as possible in order to weaken them and stop them, because he was rightfully, of course, scared that his armies would lose against Nazi Germany. However, General Anders refused to have his troops taken into combat before they were ready, equipped, trained, and well. Majority of those troops who were volunteering to this army had survived either the Gulag camps or resettlement. They were undernourished, they were in very poor health, and this army, being this beacon of Polishness among the Soviet Union, which was aptly called by one of the Polish authors an unhuman land, this army was also gathering a large number of civilians who wanted to join, to have some Polish protection against the threat of Soviet regime. And the problem was that Soviets would not provide enough food for all of them. After a number of debates, pressures, and so on and so forth, it was decided that Polish troops would be better off having moved from Soviet Union to Iran and then to British possessions in the Middle East. And this happened. About 100,000 Poles left Soviet Union this way with General Anders. Hence, you can see how it led. They were now proceeding west from Iran to Iraq, and then from the men serving and a large number of women, the Second Polish Corps was formed in mid-1943. Joining together those troops was quite difficult because the composition of Polish Second Corps was quite different than you, Guido, have mentioned at the beginning. You said that on average, a fighter in the Allied forces was about 20 years old. Not so within the Second Polish Corps, because Second Polish Corps was mostly composed of Polish reserve soldiers, those who did not serve in the active army, who were past their prime military age, because those had been fighting against the Germans and were largely taken prisoner by the Germans, or very young boys who have come of age in the Soviet Union, or not. Plenty would fake their birth date just to join the army. So Polish army was composed either of a smaller group of very young soldiers and a very large number of troops who were over 30. I think the median age of the soldiers of the Second Polish Corps in May 1944, I mean during the Battle of Monte Cassino, was 32. So they were a little bit older than the others. Since I told you that a huge number of civilians have left, those of them who could be serving in various auxiliary roles were formed in the base units, which were located finally in Palestine and in Egypt. Many civilians, especially women and children, are dispersed among the Allied possessions across the globe. There was even a group of 700 children who were shipped to New Zealand. So you can imagine the spread of those Polish civilians. There are graves of Polish civilians in Central Africa, which had been, but back then were British colonies. And there is a Indian Maharaja, who is fondly remembered as those who has financed a stay in his lands of a large group of Polish women and children. So you can see that these groups was spread across the Allied possessions in Middle East and in Asia. However, about 100,000 of Poles were formed into the Second Corps and brought to Italy to take part in action, and their first major action was the Fourth Battle of Monte Cassino. Operation Diadem, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, was the fourth battle, because from January 1944, Allies have been unsuccessfully trying to penetrate the so-called Gustav Line, the line of fortifications erected by the Germans in the narrowest part of Apennine Peninsula. And the focal point of those battles was the city of Cassino and the Abbey of Monte Cassino, towering over the town. The Abbey was, we know all that, unfortunately, the Abbey was bombed by the Americans due to mistaken belief that it was used by the Germans as a strong point. However, during 3 storms conducted by American, French, British, Indian, New Zealand troops, despite massive losses, the Germans, and by that I mean it was a German parachute division, one of the elite of Luftwaffe soldiers, the most motivated and most Nazified, if I may use this term. Just to give you an example, when Polish troops captured a few of the paratroopers during the Battle of Cassino, they were taken to a military hospital and they refused to have their given a blood transfusions because they wanted an assurance that there was not a drop of Jewish blood in the plasma they were supposed to be given. So you can imagine that somebody who is most probably suffering from terrible wounds would still refuse to get blood on some kind of ideological madness, if I may call it this way. Of course, this whole massive Monte Cassino was also defended by the German mountain troops, again, a specialized elite forces, and a number of others which were defending this narrow point. The wintry conditions in Italy also didn't help or helped the Germans to keep the defense going. The fourth Battle of Monte Cassino, Operation Diadem, began on 12th of May 1944 with huge artillery barrage, and now it was a much larger affair. Because this time the Allies would be attacking on much wider front, and Polish troops were given the honor or perhaps the unwelcome task of storming the strongest point in German defense. By that I mean the Monte Cassino Massif, not the abbey itself. They actually were trying to bypass the abbey from the north. Then in the valley, the British troops were supposed to attack, and to the left in the western part, in the so-called Aurunci Mountains, the French Expeditionary Corps was supposed to penetrate German defenses. In the two attacks, Polish troops suffered about 970 dead and nearly 3,000 wounded. It was a terribly bloody battle, and even though they failed to capture the most of German defenses, they only managed to take a few strong points in the approaches to the main German defense line. They managed to put the attention of entire German elite forces and the heavy artillery which was supporting the Germans, thus simplifying the task conducted by other Allied troops. The story is widely known how the British have managed to throw a bridge over the Rapido River in the valley, and how the French penetrated the defenses in Aurunci Mountains, thus threatening the German defenders of Gustav Line to be cut off. The Germans pulled back to the so-called Zengerriegel, or as it is called in the Allied literature, the Hitler Line, which was in turn penetrated with the attack of Canadian Corps. So you can see how a much larger Allied force was gathered for this attack and how they were layered, so that when Polish troops were spent, another force entered the fray. However, due to the mistakes made by an American general, Mark Clark, who failed to cut off German forces, because Americans were pushing also from the Anzio bridgehead. There was an attempt to get behind German lines, half-hearted attempt, and due to the relative inactivity, the Germans managed to contain the bridgehead for months. However, the Americans wanted to capture Rome as the first enemy. Well, firstly, it was supposed to be the first enemy capital to be captured by the Allies, and secondly, of course, it was Rome, the eternal city, the city which was rarely captured, and we do not need to convince anybody about the importance of Rome to the Western civilization, if I may use this simplistic term. The German managed to redeploy to the north of the peninsula, and then we know that for months and during the winter, the Allies were trying to push through. Of course, with the invasion of France started on 6th of June 1944, a large number of troops were pulled away from Italy to take part in the battles in France. So this time, Italian peninsula have become effectively a sideshow for the Allies. Nevertheless, the fighting continued. Polish troops were instrumental in capturing Ancona in July 1944, and then took part in the final weeks of the war in capture of Bologna. Of course, the story of Winter Line and the difficult campaign during the winter of 1944-45 is known. And well, the importance of Polish troops, of course, was that Poland managed to capture and put Polish flag on Monte Cassino Abbey, which was the symbol of the entire campaign. Here we can see also the British flag. It was by the direct order of General Anders that the British flag should be raised too, just to simply give credit to the most important Polish ally at the time. And of course it gave Polish troops and Polish corps a lot of visibility to the media. The problem of operation at that time was that Poles were, of course, disseminating stories about the gruesome fate they had experienced in Soviet Union and were not believed because official Allied propaganda would present Joseph Stalin and Soviet Union as an ally. And well, it was difficult for Poles to witness how the question of Polish independence after the war was getting less and less visible and less probable. Here on the slide, you see the division of Poland between Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, and you can probably see how the borders of Poland back then were much different from what Poland is now. And the fact that the borders were moved and that populations were resettled after the Second World War was an effect of the Second World War for Poland, because despite the efforts of Second Polish Corps and other Polish troops, Poland, even though it was liberated from the Germans, from Nazi Germany, by the Soviets, Poland was subdued by Soviet Union and became a satellite communist state up until 1989, so for about 3 generations. Okay, I think that should fulfill the
Thank you, Jan. Very insightful. I have a couple more questions before turning to the audience. So in the next slide, we're going to show the Museum of Second World War in Gdańsk. Anyone who has not seen it, it's really wonderful place. And given the story you mentioned, so many dimensions of it, right? Of Polish involvement from the very first day of the war, right? The war starts in Poland. In your work at the museum, how do you present today and the Polish experience in Italy to the public, and how do Polish receive this? Do they feel a connection to Italy? Do they feel a connection to, mention obviously the Monte Cassino battle and the showing of the Polish flag? So what is the relation that you see between visitors and Italy and the experience of Poles in Italy 80 years ago?
I would say that within the Museum of the Second World War, which is a unique museum because this is a museum which concentrates on the fate of individuals and especially civilians during the war, I would say that military effort is not stressed as much as the stories of resettlement, which I mentioned. A very important thing for this museum, because it was aimed also as the vehicle to present the Polish and Central European viewpoint or perspective on the events of 1939, 1945 to the especially Western audience. So the very important story that is presented there is the story of the Nazi-Soviet alliance and the Nazi-Soviet division of Central and Eastern Europe between themselves. So the stories of deportations, the story of Katyn massacre is all important. And the fates of those who were deported to the depths of Soviet Union is also very much stressed. Of course, I said we are not a military museum. However, no story of the Second World War would be complete without the history of military campaigns. But within the museum, the only army which is given more place and with the descriptions of various battles, various units, and various generals which led them is, of course, the Polish army, and the story of the Polish Second Corps is presented through the history of the Monte Cassino battle and other engagements, and of course through the history of General Anders. In the exhibition, we even have two items which belong to the general, which were donated by his second wife to the collection. You can see them. There is a caricature painting made to him, and a box for various items, which is labeled W.A. Władysław Anders. There are also items belonging to his troops. Some of them also are connected with the sad story of those soldiers, because I failed to mention that when the war ended, it of course was all the Western people celebrated the VE Day. The joy, various works of art, various shows, how everybody were absolutely happy that the war ended. And then for the Western Europe, there began the age of rebuild, the economic miracle of 1960s, 1970s, especially in Germany and France, and the ongoing liberalization and the unification of Western Europe with the creation of the forerunner to the European Union, the so-called Euro economic zone. Whereas in the Central and Eastern Poland, those were the times of communist experiments, the persecution of the former heroes of the Polish Home Army, which was the element of Poles that were fighting Germans as a secret army in occupied Poland, but also some of those who would return to Poland. There was also the story, you've shown the map of Poland, and we know now that Poland is located further to the west than it had been. So for many of those troops, their home was no longer in Poland. It was now within Soviet Union. And about 2,000 of those who decided to return to their home villages, to their home cities, which now were in Soviet Union, in early 1950s, they were again resettled by Stalin, who was becoming more and more paranoid. Again, they were resettled to camps or to deportation sites in the depths of Soviet Union. So there is a statistic. One of the Belarusian historians have researched those deportations. And of course, although there was no clear statistics on how many of those deported were former soldiers of the Second Polish Corps, there was a list of confiscated awards and medals. And among them, from Belarus, there were 975 Italy stars, so the British decoration for the Italian campaign. It doesn't, it's not surprising then that from the about 100,000 troops of Polish Second Corps who had experienced Soviet Union, only about 10% returned, and most of those who had returned were those who were never within Soviet Union. Only 32 officers decided to return to Poland from the members of the Second Polish Corps. And of course, we now see the Polish veterans marching to a victory parade. It's 10th of July 2005. So you can see this is the 60th anniversary. Am I right? Yes, 60th anniversary of the victory parade of of the end of the war. But it's significant because it was the first time when Polish veterans would be parading in London. Because during the first parade, which was held, I think, in 46 or 47, there were no Polish troops. Due to the fact that since Britain had withdrawn their support to the Polish government in exile and started accepting the communist-controlled Polish government in Warsaw, they extended invitation, of course, to the government they were recognizing. And the communists failed to send anybody to the parade. And belatedly, and I think Winston Churchill was pressuring the new Labour government to extend invitation to Polish veterans. I think only the airmen were invited, but the airmen, because airmen were famous in the Battle of Britain, and they said they refused to parade if
Hamir. Did you know the Hamir story?
I'm sorry,
No.
I can't
The
understand
kings
you.
of France had.
Hello?
Hello?
We lost whoever was speaking. We can't.
Oh,
Jan, please
okay.
continue.
I will continue. The airmen, especially the fighter pilots who were essential in the highest scoring squadron of the Battle of Britain, was actually the Polish 303 Squadron. They refused to parade if their colleagues from the land forces and the navy were not involved, and since they weren't invited, they decided not to. So there is, I think, 2 or 3 recollections of Polish veterans who were witnessing the parade in 47, seeing contingents from Brazil, from Jamaica, and for other obscure British possessions across the globe being celebrated by the elated crowds who were celebrating the great victory or the last victory of the British Empire against the continental power, because, well, British Empire is no more. And yet there were those who were unable even to return to their home country because their home country was taken over by communists. And since the fact that over 20,000 of Polish officers had been shot by the Soviets in 1940 was already published and known, their fate would be uncertain. And many of those who decided, even because those who would be returning usually were those who had families in Poland, and a number of them were imprisoned by the communists, being accused of being an imperialist spies, usually not for British, but for the Americans. The Cold War already began. And this, of course, this slight to Polish veterans was actually made better by the British in 2005, because then in the parade we are seeing now, I think the Polish veterans were actually leading the parade of veterans.
Correct.
So they were giving the honorary space. I think the current King, Charles,
Prince Charles
was essential bringing this on. Yeah,
exactly.
Prince of Wales, he was campaigning so that it would be organized this way. Okay, I think.
Thank you, Jan, and these are really insightful answers. I'm going to now open it up to the audience. If you can briefly introduce yourself and then ask a question, and whoever wants to start.
Good afternoon.
Emanuele? Hi.
Hello. If I may ask a question, it's Martin Urry and Jean Urry from South Africa. We have got several connections with Poland, as the South Africans flew and dropped supplies to the Warsaw Uprising.
Yes.
We also have interests in the Italian campaign through the 6th South African Armored Division, which also took part and did a big part in breaking the Gothic line. But my question really is, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for an interesting talk. Did the Polish Second Corps fall under the British 8th Army or the US 5th Army? The South Africans started off under the British, but then they switched over, they were pushed to the Americans later on.
Polish Second Corps was subordinated to the British 8th Army, usually. I think during the Bologna campaign it might have been switched for a while. I haven't really interested myself in this part of the campaign so much as the earlier part of Monte Cassino, but still everybody was under the army group called British Allied Armies in Italy, which was led by the British General Harold Alexander, later Field Marshal Harold Alexander. So either way, they were under British command in this or that way.
Thank you very much. Another
well, I would like to know that the efforts of South African air crews to help the Warsaw Rising are known and appreciated in Poland.
Yes, we've been to Warsaw a couple of times in respect of that. Another interesting thing that we found related to the Polish Second Corps was Wojciech the Bear. Very interesting story. Perhaps you'd like to tell the others about that.
Well, the story of the bear, which was called Wojtek, well, the fact was that one of the supply companies have obtained a bear cub in Iran. The story is conflicting because there were a few cubs, but only one of them grew to be a bear. And this company actually brought this bear to Italy with them, and supposedly this bear liked beer, was very friendly to people, and supposedly was helping carrying ammo boxes, which is But by this point, we are leaving the realm of reality and getting into mythology. And then after the war, the bear was brought to the zoo in Edinburgh and died there in early 1950s. Now has monuments across Poland. The story has become very well known because it's actually very easy to present it as a nice children's story. I know that, well, from the funny bear, which was photographed a few times, now Wojtek the bear has become an essential element for any story about the Second Polish Corps. And last time I was in near Casino area, there was even some kind of a presentation about the bear. It was showing a bear using his claws to attack German positions, which you see that the myth is evolving. Of course, it was a pet, an unusual pet, but I think that apart from the fact that the bear was friendly and the bear would be drinking beer with the soldiers, the stories how he would be helping carrying ammunition are simply stories which we should not believe as scholars, but we might find interesting and part of the mythology as those who are appreciating cultural phenomenon. It's an interesting story, but it's a story.
We had met in Krakow a person, Wojciech Narobeski, who was actually known as Little Wojciech because he was in the same company as Wojciech the Bear.
Yes, exactly.
I hear you about the mythology.
I know that the former soldiers who had settled in Britain after the war, because most of them would move from, or some stayed in Italy even, but many would move to England, to Britain, to Scotland, because Scotland was actually the base area of Polish armies which were organized in Britain. There was also the first Polish Corps was actually organized in Scotland, and from there the first Polish armored division was sent to France and fought in France. So many of Polish troops went from Italy to Britain, and then they would be visiting Wojtek in Edinburgh Zoo, and he would recognize his former wards, although he was of course in some kind of, not a cage, but the area where bears were kept. But he would recognize them and be friendly towards them. So it's a interesting story of a friendship between a massive animal and human. And it's, of course, telling that I've never heard about any, episode that this bear would be somehow aggressive towards human, because if he had, he would be either contained or even shot. So it's a rare friendliness, but because I don't think that many bears have been ever domesticized. So, yeah.
Thank you, Martin, for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Anyone else from the audience? Emanuele has a question.
Yeah, and first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. So I am Dr. Emanuele Sica. I'm one of the scientific advisor actually for the Allies Museum. Couple of things actually, because I'm Italian, but I did work in Canada actually for more than 19 years. Lots of Polish people actually went to Canada, and in fact, one of my colleagues, his parents met actually in England. I mean, he was an aviator and she was a nurse, and they resettled then in Canada. So he, Gruzinski. So he was actually, so he told me a lot about the Poland, and I got very interested actually in Poland this way. I recently actually, interest myself in the military cemeteries around Monte Cassino. One thing that you might know, but it's also worthwhile, I think, to say that I would like also to have some clarification, is that the day after the battles on the 18th of May 1944, Anders already in his order of the day told his troops that there will be actually a cemetery in Monte Cassino. So they already had this idea, even when the ruins were still smoldering, right? I mean, and just after a battle. So I think it was important for the Poles to, because as you mentioned, right, this is the first big battle for Poland. Yes. So it's a way for them to say, okay, we are present, and we are fighting as a nation, and we want to be recognized. And I think that the cemetery, if I remember correctly, was also inaugurated actually on the 1st of September 1945. It was entirely built by the Second Corps. You know that, right? I mean, the engineers, the architects, everyone was actually it was incredible. Actually, I mean, when I heard about the story,
was plenty of talents within the Corps. Yes.
Yeah, and you mentioned it actually builds on your idea, right? These were, well, I wouldn't say middle aged because I'm actually 50. So I mean, I don't want actually to build myself like this. But anyway, there were people who were not very young people. There were a lot of talented, architect and so two of the main architects, and I think many of the engineers were all Poles. But my question was, it seems to me that after the war, the cemetery will become kind of a symbol of the Polish diaspora, right?
Yes.
I mean, because Anders wanted to be buried, and he was buried there like in the 1970s, if I remember. So, can you clarify that? So, were there ceremonies actually in the cemeteries after the Second World War? Because I don't know about that part of the story.
Well, of course, Monte Cassino would become, I think, with the Battle of Falaise and the Battle of Arnhem as the three most known battles of Polish ground forces in the Second World War in the West. Monte Cassino by far was the most important one because the number of troops involved was great, because Monte Cassino itself is one of the greatest symbols of Western culture and the history of Europe. The first abbey, that's really a symbol. You are right that the cemetery was built by the engineers and architects who were serving within the Second Polish Corps or its auxiliary units. Apart from cemetery, which is less known, the monuments were also erected and the rudimentary directions on the battlefield were made. Of course, now everything is now grown over with vegetation, so no longer can you see clearly the areas which were stormed by Poles, but you can still walk the path there and enter the hills like 593, which is the height in meters above the sea level, which was the main defense points of the Germans taken by the 3rd Polish Carpathian Division after the Germans largely withdrew from there. And the hill 575, which was the point of attack of the 5th Division of the Polish Corps. You can also enter the area where Polish tanks tried to penetrate German defenses, which is right over the cemetery. When there is a wreck of Polish tank which was destroyed by the mine, and there's the monument of the 4th Polish tank. 4th Polish Armored Regiment with scorpion, because, African scorpion was a symbol of the tank because it was created from the unit that fought in Tobruk in North Africa. So you can see how Second Polish Corps itself was a blend of many military traditions. And this cemetery indeed is most known, because if you ever ask around in Poland about the Polish military cemetery in Italy, they would say Monte Cassino, but they would very rarely mention Loreto, Casa Massima, or Bologna, because there are 4 Polish military cemeteries in Italy, and only Monte Cassino is, I think, the almost automatically selected as a point to visit apart from Rome. Poles would go to Rome. When John Paul II was still alive, they would visit Vatican. Now they would visit his grave, of course. And then if they ever venture beyond Rome, they will not go to, or even if they are traveling to Pompeii, they would stop at Monte Cassino to visit the cemetery. And I was in Monte Cassino this year during the anniversary celebrations, and on the parking lot near the cemetery, about 80% of cars had Polish number plates, so you can imagine. And of course, the cemetery at Monte Cassino was a very important point for celebration for the Polish diaspora during the Cold War. So they were gathering there on the 18th of May to celebrate the victory. General Anders would travel there, and you're right that he was buried there in 1970. However, and it's interesting, that from about 1960s, the communist authorities in Poland started to switch their stance in order to keep or win over the dwindling social support. They started to say that in the Polish armed forces in the West, only the leaders and generals were ideologically wrong, whereas common soldiers were good because they were fighting the Germans. An interesting piece of interesting fact is that the communists actually have officially removed, deprived General Anders and over 100 of other officers of Polish citizenship. They would say that they are no longer Poles. So you can imagine. But from 1960s and so on and so forth, they started to honor the veterans or the families of veterans, and they were starting sending delegations from Poland on the same celebration. So actually 18th of May would be a moment in 1970s, and especially in 1984, it was the 40th anniversary of the battle. It was a point where those veterans who stayed in the West and those who returned to Poland would meet. In 1984, the communists would work very hard to celebrate it, and they even sent the official head of state, because in Poland, of course, the real leader was the chief of the Communist Party, but officially there was a head of state, the chief of the council, of the National Council, which was a figurehead really. But the fact that they sent him for this event shows that they wanted to somehow hijack the Polish patriotic tradition to serve communism, which was, of course, failing after Solidarity and so on and so forth. But you're right, the cemetery of Monte Cassino, by the efforts of the Western veterans and by also those celebrations in the West, was those delegations sent from communist Poland became the symbol of Polish efforts to fight the Germans during the war. And of course, it's worth to remember that the Battle of Monte Cassino is also connected with a very famous, or perhaps the most famous Polish patriotic song, the Red Poppies of Monte Cassino, which was written by two artists working in a propaganda unit of the Second Polish Corps. Again, a number of talents were enlisted as soldiers in the Second Corps and serving the auxiliary roles. They wrote a song which became immensely popular, and this song was popular also in communist Poland, although usually not celebrated by the authorities, but kept by the society, by ordinary people, as the memento of those efforts, which were not officially recognized for many years after the Second World War.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Manuel. I think Reed has one question, and we still have time. Reed, you want to ask your question?
Hi, everyone. Hi. Yeah, thank you very much for the very insightful webinar. And I don't think I missed this part, but I walked away for a second, so pardon if you already answered this. But of course, General Anders is very much regarded as a wartime hero, and as such, a lot of the things that I read, start very much focus on him. Of course, the Second Polish Corps. One thing that I haven't really been able to find a lot about is sort of the political element of what was going on during this period. So as we know, when you overviewed the beginning of World War II, Poland was seized and divided. Then we have the Soviets coming back to the Allies, looking for a good partner against Germany. Soviets had seized almost half of Poland. They bring Anders out of prison. He comes and raises his army. Where is the political effort? What is happening behind the scenes, or is it led by Anders? to, to try to their best to avoid the Soviets from keeping this territory that they seized in 39, because my understanding is after the war, they seized that, and it was then communist Poland, which is part of USSR until 1989. Was there a political effort? Was there someone leading that to try to say, hey, we've had our land seized, but we want it all back? And I look towards maybe, maybe some of the efforts that was happening in terms of raising the state of Israel, for example. There was a lot of backdoor communications trying to negotiate. Was that happening for Poland on its behalf?
The huge problem that Poland had, of course, was lack of political punch. Really, when Poland was overrun by the Germans and Soviets, Polish government moved to Romania, hoping to be kept in power. However, before the war, Poland was ruled by authoritarian clique. It was not a democracy, a working democracy. It was kept by the allies of the late Marshal Pilsudski, who nominated his successor, and they were leading Poland. They were widely blamed in Poland for failure to keep the Germans at bay. And secondly, they were not accepted by the Polish ally, the French, who France was a democratic country back then, and of course didn't look well on Polish authoritarian authorities. And whenever they had a chance, they jumped at it to have them removed. And then the leader of Poland, the prime minister, and the head of Polish armed forces was General Władysław Sikorski. Władysław Sikorski was a political enemy of the pre-war Polish regime, but he had great connections in France, and when there was a chance, the French were instrumental in putting him into as Polish leader. And of course, it worked up until the Germans invaded France and quickly defeated it, and then Poles would escape from France to Britain. And from 1940, General Sikorski resided in London. And in 1940, actually, the Polish position was the greatest because, well, we were the only ally when the France was knocked over. Poland was the last ally of Britain. And by that, I mean the British Empire, so the entire global power, but still it was important. Secondly, Polish airmen, as I mentioned before, were absolutely essential during the Battle of Britain, scoring numerous kills over the German Luftwaffe, so they were famous. The position of Poland was greater then. But from the moment the Soviet Union got involved in the war, Churchill, looking realistically at the situation, Churchill chose not to antagonize the Soviet Union. And from the moment that the United States joined the war, Britain itself became marginalized in this tandem. We know now that the political advisors of the President of the United States were infiltrated by communist agents, which didn't help Poland, of course, and that Stalin was absolutely adamant at keeping his territorial gains. This is, of course, all based into the story of how Poland was resurrected in 1918, 1919, 1920, when there were debates whether Poland should extend as far east, because there were many minorities there. It's an interesting and complicated story. However, from the moment that the Soviet Union and United States joined the effort, Polish political power was in steady decline. The tragedy struck in 1943 first, when the Germans discovered the graves of Polish officers shot at Katyn. Polish government in exile urged caution, being afraid that this is a German ruse to antagonize the Allies. However, Poland's government requested that the Swiss Red Cross would investigate the site. And then Stalin immediately broke any relations with Polish government in exile. And this was, of course, this story was naturally not disseminated by Allied press. especially English language press, because it would depict an ally, Soviet Union, in the bad position. And in early July 1943, unfortunately, General Sikorski died in a plane crash in Gibraltar. He was actually visiting Polish troops of the Polish Second Corps. So he met with Anders, there were talks. And there was, of course, a lot of antagonism between Anders and Sikorski due to the fact that Sikorski actually signed a treaty with the Soviets, whereas in this treaty, he did not stipulate that the lands from which most of Anders' soldiers hailed from would be kept. It was left to be debated afterwards. It would seem that Sikorski was more realistic, and he was trying to, he was absolutely sure, it seems, that Poland would not be able to keep all the lands it had in the east, even though, of course, taking them was absolutely illegal from any point of view of international law, and that effectively Soviet Union was an aggressor and was guilty of numerous despicable crimes. But you know that when real politics kicks in, people tend to neglect such things. I think it was Reagan who said that he's a bastard, but it's our bastard, right? Am I right? Ronald Reagan, I think, when he was meeting with those African dictators who were anti-communist in Africa. I think that rings a bell. I vaguely remember this kind of saying. So you know that I said Polish power was in decline, and then after Sikorski died, the divisions between within Polish spheres was even greater. After Monte Cassino, when Warsaw Rising started, General Anders was appalled because he did not see any possibility that the Rising would be doing help. And of course, before that, we've had meetings of which were kept under rugs, but some information leaked, especially the Tehran conference, in which we see now President Roosevelt. He basically agreed that Stalin would keep his territorial gains, and not only Eastern Poland, but even more disturbingly, the Baltic states. And really, Stalin didn't have to fight for it. I think that Roosevelt, being ill-advised by some of his members of his circle, simply yielded over this issue or didn't think it very important. However, the chief blow to the Polish chances was first Warsaw Rising, when there was not effective help from the Soviet Union, because the sacrifice of South African aircrews and Polish aircrews were flying those supply drops from Italy to Warsaw was great. The losses were enormous, and the Soviets refused to allow those planes to land in Soviet-controlled area and refuel for many weeks. Only in the latter stages of the Rising, they actually allowed American bombers to land within Soviet Union, but it was after 6 weeks of fighting in Warsaw and massive losses suffered. And then, of course, in early 1945, the Yalta Conference was held, and then the agreement, the Yalta Agreement, was published, and this agreement basically stated not only that Poland would lose its lands in the east and would be given some unspecified compensation at the cost of Germany, but also it was stated that there will be a joint Polish, that there should be a government which would be composed of Polish communists. And in Poland, before the war, communism was a fringe group supported by Soviet Union, and now they were supposed to be running the country in cooperation with the lawful Polish government in exile. And there was a promise that free elections will be held in Poland, but, well, it all turned out to be a sham. But there were a lot of resignations among the Polish leaders. Prime Minister were changing, shifting. Even the Sikorski's successor, in protest, basically due to the fact that Warsaw Rising was fighting, not obtaining good help, he actually resigned and made the head of Polish Home Army in Warsaw the value that now the leader of the armed forces of one of the allies will be taken prisoner by the Germans. So I'm not a historian of politics, and these are murky and complicated, but there are some, of course, recollections how Anders was protesting to Churchill about the way Poland was treated, and how Churchill at one point said that, well, dear general, if you don't like it, you can pull your divisions away and walk away. We will do without you, you know. So that was this kind of pressure. We know now that Churchill was actually trying to influence Roosevelt to be less complacent towards Soviet demands, but at the same time, he would be also pressuring Poles to be more agreeable to various changes. I think that at one point Churchill said that Poles are very peculiar because they are the bravest of the brave, but their leaders are the foulest of the foul, I think, because he couldn't, you know, talk with them. Some of the politicians in the exile circus in Poland were actually not of a very large caliber, but, well, it doesn't change the fact that effectively Poland, even though Britain went to war to keep Polish independence, effectively Poland was deprived of its independence and sovereignty and democracy and freedom of speech up until 1989. And, well, believe me or not, but in 1987, when I went to grammar school, my parents, before the first day, pulled me aside and told me that I should never, ever talk about Soviet Union to anybody in school, especially never mention the name Katyn to anyone. If the teacher asks me about it, I should say that I've never heard this name before. I don't know what they are talking about because, well, I went to school when Poland was still a non-democratic, communist-ruled country without freedom of speech, with censorship and secret police monitoring the population.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for the question. We are 10 minutes overdue, but Jan, I mean, thank you for your generosity today. This was a very insightful webinar. Thank you all for attending and questions. Again, the recording will be made available in the next few days, and hope to see you all at our future webinars.